talking to Tucker Carlson today. The crazy thing about the topic of UFOs is how, when you get into it, how really non-crazy a lot of the people who know a lot about the topic turn out to be. They're kind of the opposite of what you imagine. They're not for conspiracy nuts. A lot of them are just scientists. Garry Nolan is definitely at the top of that list. He's a Stanford professor, Stanford PhD. He's an immunologist. And he has, over the last decade or two, spent a lot of time studying the harmful effects that apparent encounters with UFOs have on the human brain. This is a field of study, and he is at the very top of it. Dr. Garry Nolan joins us in studio. Professor, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you so much.
I was just reading to restate the same point once more, it's just remarkable once you get into this topic. I don't know if mainstream is the word, but it's not fringe at all. So just to kind of to accentuate that point, explain your background for our viewers, if you would.
So my main job, my day job at Stanford for the last 30 years has been the development of technologies to look at cancer and blood. And so we've spun a number of companies and sold a number of companies that we started out of my lab. Two of them are actually on NASDAQ. And the idea has always been that if money is coming in from the NIH, we should give back to the public. And so in the process of developing some of these, we developed an instrument called CyTOF, which is really all about studying blood cells at a deeper level than anybody's been able to do before. And so it was circa 2011 or so when some people from the CIA and an aerospace company came to me to ask me for their help on the analysis of some individuals who had encountered some anomalous objects, they said. And I mean, they came to my office unannounced and then started laying out pictures and data on the table in front of me. And I honestly thought it was a joke. I thought it was.
Wait, so you're a Stanford professor, an immunologist doing medical research and building companies, and all of a sudden one day the CIA shows up at your office?
Because they had asked around and said, okay, we have these people who've been injured. And one of the things that they wanted to do in a complete medical workup of these individuals was to look at the blood. It's a natural thing to do. If you're looking for an inflammation, the blood is one of the places you might look to get a sort of a more complete list of everything that's going on in the body. And so that's when somebody said, well, if you want to do this, do it properly, you got to go talk to this guy Nolan at Stanford, because he has the world's best instrument that he's developed for doing it. And that's what started it.
So what was your view of UFOs, UAPs at the time?
You know, I was kind of a science fiction fan, and I was interested in it as any mainstream individual might have been. But it wasn't something that I had any kind of focus on in my life.
So you had no deep knowledge of the topic?
No deep knowledge.
Were you surprised that a U.S. government agency was doing this kind of work? I mean, presumably the question was settled for them. They didn't wonder if UFOs were real. They knew at that point, right?
Right. No, of course. I mean, like I said, at first I thought it was a joke. I mean, I really thought that somebody was about to put me on candid camera and make a joke of it. But as they started showing me the data, and they were deadly serious. I mean, I tried to lure them into making a joke about it. They were deadly serious about it, because they had basically said at that point, people have died. And then they showed me some brain images of individuals who had been damaged, and internal scarring you can see through MRIs. And, you know, it's data. It's unmistakable. You have to say, okay, well, what did that? I can conjecture or hypothesize about, you know, is it the Russians? Is it UFOs or whatever? But the fact is, there is data that says something is happening, and so we need to study it. And that's what a scientist should do.
Of course. Oh, absolutely.
You know, but my point has been that whatever this stuff is hundreds of technology revolutions ahead of us, and understandings of physics that we don't appreciate.
Right.
So it's kind of like, I mean, the old saw is send a cell phone back to a Neanderthal and see what he does with it. You know, pound rocks.
He eats it, yeah. No. So, it sounds like in the world that you live in, it is taken for granted, it is assumed to be true, that this stuff is real.
Yes. Yeah, it's 100% real. I mean, there's just no doubt about it. I mean, the data is real. And this is what when I have these conversations with other scientists who have told me, Garry, you're going to ruin your reputation. It's like, well, my reputation has been always going against the grain, and look at where I am. I'm perfectly fine going against the grain. This is real, and we need to pay attention to it, and it's just unscientific to not study it.
Yes, amen.
Right? I mean, it's just wrong. And if you're going to be that way, you're a priest, you're not a scientist.
Amen. Thank you for saying that. I feel that way about a lot of things. that touch science, but this is definitely one of them. So why would the aerospace company that you have not named, I've noticed, why would they be interested in finding, along with the CIA, the answers to these questions?
Technology. I mean, you've seen the reports on how these things move. 0 to 5,000 miles an hour, instantaneous acceleration and deceleration, transmedium travel.
Yeah. Meaning from air to water.
Air to water. Yeah. We can't do any of that. We just can't.
And moreover, we don't know how it's done.
We don't know how it's done. And so that means that there's a level of physics that can be appreciated and maybe taken advantage of. I mean, hundreds, thousands of years ago, we looked at birds and we saw they could fly and we said, we want to fly. So now we see this happening and now we realize that our physics doesn't answer how that moves. So we need new physics. And so that to me is the most important aspect of this. But if we go back to like where my career came from, I always look at data and say, what can I do with this and make something out of it to give back? What technology can I create that can be used by everybody? So similarly, I look at these materials, and I do have some public materials, and I say, if I can understand these at the atomic level and understand how these things are put together, I might not understand how anti-gravity works, but I can now bring in scientists who might be experts in the kinds of atoms that are there and say, tell me what this might have been used for, because this is where it came from.
But I mean, all of it was sort of like alighting around the central question, which is like, who made these? Like, who are these people, these things? What is this force? It's not human.
I don't know. I mean, and that's why it's so hard for me not to say what I think it really is, because if I do say it is absolutely this, people will start to question.
Of course, because you can't know, right?
Right. But I think the better way to do it is to convince people that the data is real.
Let's move back just one sentence.
Yeah.
So without putting your professional credibility, reputation on the line, et cetera, you're around people who study this stuff for a living, who are the most knowledgeable people on this topic in the world.
Yes.
What is their general sense of what this might be?
That this is not from Earth.
Right. That it's not from Earth, that this is these are aliens, essentially.
And, until I see a piece of technology that does something I don't understand, or until I see an alien body, I'm going to also remain skeptical.
Of course, as you should.
But it doesn't mean I won't study it. And people say, well, why, if you are so skeptical still, you're studying it? Because it's the most important thing that could have ever
Of course, but that's why we cover it on the show. Not because I have no special knowledge. I know nothing, really. But
why by
definition, it's the most important. So is the general belief that these objects, whatever this is coming from outside our atmosphere, or that it's coming from beneath the oceans?
Both, I think. I mean, whatever it is, it's clearly been here for a long time. And it doesn't necessarily care so much about us, but in terms of, if it wanted to wipe us out, it could.
Clearly, obviously.
All you got to do is go out to the asteroid belt and push a big rock our way, and that's the end of us with the next dinosaur problem. So the next question is, well, if they've been here all along, before we were even civilized, well, whose planet is this really?
And do you think that there is evidence that this is an ongoing thing?
Yeah. I mean, so I don't know if you know the astronomer and venture capitalist Jacques Vallée. You probably heard of him.
Of course, yes.
And so he's actually a good friend. He's written books about the matter, showing that if you go back into the historical records, things written by the scientists and philosophers and mayors and kings of the day, it's in the record. This object was seen, it looked like a wheel, or it looked like a shield, and it showed up over our battles, and, et cetera, et cetera. So you can go back and recontext the observations and say, well, if somebody wrote that today, I'd call it a UFO or a UAP, right?
Of course.
So it's been here. I think really, one thing you have to ask is, well, why do they show up? And maybe it's just, and why don't they land? That's a question I often get asked is, well, why would you? I mean, do you try to establish diplomatic relations with the ants in your garden when you move into a new house? Right. No, you do what you want and you dig up the yard and you do as you please. You try not to interfere with them. If there's a nest of birds, you're not going to interfere. You're going to try not to bother them. So, because you've got your own business going on, you're doing your own thing. So what that thing is, I don't know.
There does seem to be some connection between nuclear power, nuclear weapons, nuclear fission itself, and these objects. I mean, have you clearly noticed this?
Yes. Well, I think if you ask yourself the question, how could we negatively interact with them? right? I mean, there's probably little that even they could do if we blew up a nuclear bomb around them. So to the extent that we have reached a level of technological capability where we can be a problem to them, nuclear weapons are one of them, right? I mean, but look as far as where we're going to be 1,000 years from now. We're starting to move out into, like with Elon Musk, into Mars. Maybe someday we'll be able to travel to other solar systems even by conventional means. So if you are an emerging species in this area of the galaxy and there are elders running around, maybe they want to pay attention to the monkeys who, are usually throwing mud up against each other on the walls and stuff.
No, it's a completely... Does this bother you at all?
No. I think it's exciting. I mean, why would it bother me? I mean, because I don't think that they're here necessarily to harm us. And if they want to, they can. So nothing I have any control over. So,
is there any evidence of the 100 cases that you've looked at that any of those human beings were harmed on purpose?
No. I think it's just as bad. Like if you happen to walk across an airfield and get in the way of the exhaust plume of a jet engine, you're going to get harmed.
Before I ask you to describe what those harms are, because you've seen strong patterns, right,
Yep.
in the harms.
Yep.
There are innumerable first-person accounts of people who claim they have been taken into some craft and experimented upon.
Right.
Have you come across those, and how do you assess them?
I come across those, but I, have a hard time. It's like what I was saying before. It's an encounter. It's an experience, but whether those experiences are real or whether or not they're imposed on these individuals as sort of an altered reality memory, I don't know. I mean, here's an example. There's a great case. It's in France. This family, this is just within the last few years, driving down the highway, a mother and 2 children in the back. They have an open-top car during the day, a crowded highway. They see over their head through the window a craft. I mean, it's just obvious. And then she's looking around, the mother's looking around and then saying, and noticing that nobody else seems to see this. Okay? So the kids in the back have a camera, a phone, take a picture. When they get home, they take a look at the picture. There's not a craft, but there's an object, a small sort of star-shaped object about 30 or 40 feet over their car. So let's say that's the object, but it projected an image of something else, and yet that's all they saw. So what happened? It's sort of like it was a projected 3D image of something, but it was only seen by them. So when you start to hear many of these cases, and Jacques Vallée talks about this a lot, that whatever these things are, seem to have the ability to project altered reality into people's minds. I know that sounds crazy. And I'm just repeating the stories.
Well, no crazier than any other thing that we've been talking about. Right. I mean, it's all outside the bounds of what we understand as science anyway, right?
Yeah, I mean, and I have the picture that they took of that star-shaped object and the story, and Jacques had been the person who went and did the interviews for it. And that was sort of a mind bender for me. The first time that I had seen evidence of something that was different than what people had perceived, right? And so this notion of projected reality is something that really has to be part of the discussion at some point.
So there have been, over centuries, many centuries, reports of livestock being killed, drained of blood, in conjunction with sightings of these objects.
Right.
Have you come across anything
I mean,
like that?
I know of it, and I know the woman, Linda Moulton Howe, who did a lot of these original studies. Again, it's data. I don't know why anything would want to do that.
Right.
I really don't. And I don't know how it fits into the big picture of this, because there's so many moving parts. It's very hard to create a consolidated story about it. And, the only way that I can create a consolidated story is to say that there's more than one thing here.
Right.
Right. That these things are somehow in tension with each other. I mean, much like when the colonial Europe went around the world into Africa and India, et cetera, and basically were fighting each other, England against Spain and France, et cetera. Maybe that's a little bit about what we're seeing here, is that these things are in some kind of tension with each other and that there is no unifying motivation.
Is there evidence that there's a lot of this kind of activity undersea?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, plenty. right? The sonar images show these things moving at speeds a dozen times faster than our fastest submarines, with no cavitation, right? No, no basically bubbles behind them, because the movement would create a vacuum and would, basically make a giant bubble, and we'd get this noise. No noise, just sonar images.
So, given your background in science, is that explicable?
No.
No, it's not.
No.
Okay.
You have to imagine the new kinds of physics. But interestingly, the physicists have come up with a unifying, let's say, mathematics for what these things might be doing and how they're doing it.
Huh. Does it make sense to you?
Yeah. I mean, one of them is called, there's actually a Mexican physicist. He has worked out the equations for a warp drive. I mean, we can't do it. The amounts of energy required are extraordinary. It's called the Alcubierre drive. But then there's a number of other individuals who have then taken his equations and shown that, that it actually explains how these things might be moving.
But there's a lot of data from underwater.
Correct.